A luxury hotel manager mocked what he thought was a confused old man and ordered a black housekeeper out of sight before the biggest meeting of his career. But minutes later, the billionaire revealed a truth that left the entire boardroom speechless and forced everyone to confront the one person they had ignored all along. What happened next didn't just save a hotel. It changed every life inside it forever. Rain drifted lazily across downtown Charleston, soft enough to blur the city lights, but steady enough to leave every sidewalk glistening beneath the warm glow of antique street lamps. The Grand Lexington Hotel stood proudly on the corner of King Street, like a monument to old Southern elegance. Its limestone columns shimmered under golden lights, and polished brass doors reflected the silhouettes of arriving guests who expected perfection before they ever crossed the threshold. Inside, everything moved with rehearsed precision. Bellmen straightened luggage carts. Valets adjusted white gloves. The concierge rehearsed names of important arrivals under his breath. Every crystal chandelier sparkled as though it had been polished moments before. Because today was different. Today, the Grand Lexington wasn't simply welcoming another wealthy traveler. It was waiting for William Carter. Everyone in Charleston knew the name. William Carter wasn't just another billionaire. He had spent 40 years building one of the largest luxury hospitality investment companies in America. Hotels, resorts, vineyards, historic estates. If Carter invested in a property, its value doubled before construction crews even unpacked their tools. Rumor had spread through the city for weeks. He was considering purchasing the entire Grand Lexington brand. If the deal happened, the hotel would become the flagship property of an international luxury chain. If it failed, no one wanted to imagine the consequences. General Manager Richard Collins certainly didn't. At 52 years old, Richard had spent over 2 decades climbing the hospitality ladder, one careful promotion at a time. Every promotion had required longer hours, missed holidays, forgotten anniversaries, and sacrifices he no longer talked about. Today was supposed to reward all of that. One flawless meeting, one perfect impression, one signature. That was all standing between him and the executive position he'd dreamed about for years. He checked his reflection in the marble pillar for the 3rd time in less than 5 minutes. His navy suit looked immaculate, tie perfectly centered, shoes polished until they reflected the ceiling lights. He adjusted his cufflinks anyway. "You've got one chance," he muttered quietly. Behind him, department managers waited in a neat line. The executive chef, the guest relations director, the head concierge. Everyone knew exactly where to stand, exactly when to smile, exactly when to speak. Richard glanced toward the revolving doors. They're almost here. Outside, 3 black SUVs rolled slowly beneath the hotel's covered entrance. The engines stopped. Every conversation inside the lobby disappeared. Even the pianist in the lounge gently lifted his hands from the keys. Richard inhaled. Places. The first security officer stepped out. Then another, finally. The rear passenger door opened. William Carter emerged slowly from the vehicle. At 67, he carried himself with effortless confidence. His charcoal overcoat fit perfectly despite the rain. Silver hair framed a face marked by experience rather than age. He wasn't flashy. There were no oversized watches, no loud entourage, just quiet authority, the kind money couldn't buy. Richard stepped forward immediately, extending both hands with practiced warmth. "Mr. Carter, welcome to the Grand Lexington. It's an honor to have you with us." William smiled politely. "Thank you." His voice was calm, measured, almost understated. Behind him walked 4 senior executives from Carter Hospitality Group. Each carried leather portfolios. Each quietly observed every corner of the hotel. Nothing escaped their attention. The marble, the lighting, the staff, even the scent floating through the lobby. Richard noticed their careful eyes and smiled even wider. Everything was going exactly as planned, until he saw her. Across the enormous lobby, Grace Johnson slowly pushed a housekeeping cart toward the east hallway. She wore the standard gray housekeeping uniform, with her name stitched neatly above the pocket. Her dark curls were tied neatly beneath a simple headband. White cleaning gloves covered her hands. She wasn't doing anything unusual. She was simply replacing fresh towels in one of the guest corridors. But from Richard's perspective, she was moving directly into William Carter's line of sight. His heartbeat skipped. No, not now, not today. Without thinking, he reached for the small radio clipped beneath his jacket. His voice dropped into a sharp whisper. Emma. The head of housekeeping answered instantly. Yes, sir? Where's Grace? Emma looked around before answering. East lobby, finishing the afternoon rotation. Richard's jaw tightened. Get her out of there. I'm sorry. You heard me. His eyes never left Grace. Don't let her get anywhere near Mr. Carter. Emma hesitated. Sir, she's just cleaning. I don't care. His voice became colder. Move her. Emma looked uncertain. Before she could respond, Richard stepped away from the welcoming line and walked directly toward Grace. His polished shoes clicked sharply against the marble floor. Grace noticed him approaching and immediately stopped pushing her cart. Afternoon, Mr. Collins. She offered a polite smile. Richard didn't return it. His eyes flicked toward William, who was still greeting the executive team, then back to Grace. His voice remained low enough that nearby guests wouldn't hear. What are you doing out here? Grace blinked. Room 418 requested extra linens. I don't care. He pointed toward the service hallway. Take the back corridor. It's blocked because maintenance. I said use another route. Grace glanced toward the hallway. There isn't another one. Richard's patience snapped. For heaven's sake. He leaned closer. Don't let Mr. Carter see you. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Grace simply looked at him. Not angry, not surprised. Almost tired. She had heard different versions of those words before. Stay in the back. Use the service elevator. Wait until the guests leave. Don't walk through the lobby. Don't be seen. 4 years at the Grand Lexington had taught her exactly what invisible meant. She lowered her eyes. I'm sorry. Richard exhaled impatiently. Just move. Grace quietly turned the cart around. Its wheels squeaked softly as she pushed it toward the service corridor. No argument, no complaint, only silence. Richard immediately straightened his jacket and returned to the entrance with his professional smile restored. Problem solved, or so he believed, because something unexpected happened. As William Carter followed Richard toward the reception area, he stopped walking. Only for a second. His gaze shifted past the polished concierge desk, past the flower arrangements, toward the woman quietly disappearing behind the service hallway. Grace never noticed. She kept walking. Head slightly lowered, hands resting on the cart handle, but William noticed. He watched her just long enough for one of his executives to ask quietly, "Everything all right, sir?" William didn't answer immediately. His eyes remained fixed on the closing service door. Finally, he nodded. Yes. But his expression had changed. It wasn't curiosity. It wasn't suspicion. It looked more like recognition. Richard completely missed it. He launched into a polished introduction as they walked through the lobby. Our hotel was originally built in 1928. William listened politely. At least, it appeared that way. Yet every few moments his eyes wandered back toward the hallway where Grace had disappeared. The rain outside grew heavier. Water streamed down the enormous windows overlooking King Street. Inside, waiters served fresh coffee. Crystal glasses reflected golden light. The pianist resumed playing soft jazz. Everything looked perfect. Everything sounded perfect. Everything had been choreographed for one purpose: convince William Carter to invest. No one realized that the most important moment of the afternoon had already happened. It hadn't happened during Richard's flawless welcome. It hadn't happened beneath the chandeliers. It hadn't happened in the executive suite waiting upstairs. It had happened during a conversation lasting less than 30 seconds, between a manager desperate to protect appearances and a woman who quietly accepted humiliation because she'd grown used to carrying it. As Grace disappeared deeper into the employee hallway, she paused only once. She rested one hand on the cleaning cart, closed her eyes, took a slow breath, then continued working. Outside, thunder rolled faintly over Charleston Harbor. Upstairs, boardroom lights flickered on as assistants prepared contracts worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Downstairs, Richard believed he'd successfully hidden the one employee who might embarrass the hotel. He couldn't have known that before the day was over, the quiet housekeeper he'd pushed out of sight would become the single most important person inside the Grand Lexington. And the question William Carter carried silently into the boardroom had nothing to do with hotel profits. It had everything to do with the woman everyone else had tried so hard not to see. Long before the rain had begun falling over Charleston, long before 3 black SUVs pulled beneath the Grand Lexington's entrance, Grace Johnson had already been awake for nearly 4 hours. At 4:45 that morning, her alarm buzzed softly on the nightstand beside an aging lamp with a faded linen shade. She reached over before it could sound a second time, careful not to wake the only other person in the small apartment. The room was quiet, except for the distant hum of freight trains crossing the Cooper River and the gentle rhythm of rain tapping against the bedroom window. Grace sat on the edge of the bed for a moment. She stretched her aching shoulders. Another day, another shift, another chance to do work most people would never notice. She slipped into a simple sweatshirt and quietly walked toward the kitchen. The apartment wasn't much. 2 small bedrooms, old hardwood floors that creaked no matter how carefully someone walked, paint peeling near the windows, a refrigerator that hummed louder every month. But it was clean. Every picture frame hung straight, every blanket folded neatly. Fresh flowers, picked from a neighborhood community garden 2 days earlier, rested inside an old mason jar on the table. Grace believed people deserved beauty, even when life couldn't afford luxury. She filled a kettle with water and placed it on the stove. As steam slowly rose, she opened a worn notebook resting beside the coffee maker. Inside were columns of numbers. Rent, electric bill, groceries, prescription refills, medical appointments. Everything was carefully written in neat handwriting. She circled one date, Thursday. Her aunt's dialysis appointment. The treatment wasn't optional. Neither was the gas needed to drive across town. Grace quietly closed the notebook before allowing herself to think too long about the numbers. Worry had never paid a single bill. Her Aunt Evelyn appeared in the doorway a few moments later, wrapped in a knitted gray cardigan despite the warm apartment. At 58, illness had taken much of her strength, but none of her kindness. "You've been up a while," Evelyn said with a sleepy smile. "I couldn't sleep. You say that every morning." Grace laughed softly. "Because it's true every morning." Evelyn slowly lowered herself into a chair. "You work too hard." Grace poured hot water into 2 mugs. "So do you." "I used to." "You still do." Evelyn smiled. "You just don't get paid for worrying anymore." Grace slid the mug across the table. "Drink before it gets cold." For several quiet minutes, neither woman spoke. Morning silence had become part of their routine. Comfortable, familiar. Outside, the first city buses began rolling through the neighborhood. Inside, the smell of cinnamon tea filled the apartment. Finally, Evelyn looked toward Grace. "You have that important visitor today?" Grace nodded. "The whole hotel's talking about him. The billionaire, so they say. You nervous?" Grace shrugged. "I'll probably never see him." Evelyn smiled knowingly. "You always see people." Grace looked confused. "I mean," Evelyn continued gently, "you notice people. The lonely ones, the tired ones, the forgotten ones." Grace looked down into her tea. "I guess somebody should." Evelyn reached across the table and squeezed her hand. "Don't ever let this world convince you that's a weakness." Grace smiled. "I won't." But even as she said the words, she wasn't completely sure. 20 minutes later, she stepped outside into the cool Charleston morning. The neighborhood was waking slowly. An elderly man swept his porch. A woman unlocked her small barber shop. 2 sanitation workers laughed while loading recycling bins into the back of their truck. Grace waved to everyone she passed. Everyone waved back. She wasn't wealthy. She wasn't important. But in this neighborhood, people knew her name. The city bus arrived exactly on schedule. Grace climbed aboard, greeting the driver before taking her usual seat near the middle. She watched Charleston wake through rain-speckled windows. Historic churches, corner cafes, brick sidewalks glistening beneath cloudy skies. Luxury boutiques slowly opening their doors. By the time the bus reached King Street, the contrast between her neighborhood and downtown became impossible to ignore. Expensive cars lined the streets. Doormen welcomed elegantly dressed guests. Tourists admired architecture older than the country itself. The Grand Lexington stood proudly at the center of it all. Grace stepped off the bus and walked toward the employee entrance around the side of the building. No marble. No chandeliers. No red carpet. Only gray steel doors beside the loading dock. She scanned her employee badge. The lock clicked. Inside, fluorescent lights replaced morning sunshine. The employee hallway smelled faintly of fresh detergent and industrial floor cleaner. Housekeepers gathered near the supply room. Some laughed. Some looked exhausted. Others silently poured coffee into paper cups before another long shift. Emma Rodriguez, the housekeeping supervisor, stood behind a clipboard checking assignments. She looked up as Grace approached. "Morning." "Morning." Emma handed over today's room list. 21 rooms. Grace glanced down. That's more than yesterday. Emma sighed. "We're short 2 people." Grace simply nodded. "I'll make it work." "I know you will." Emma hesitated before lowering her voice. Richard's been on edge all week. Grace smiled faintly. When isn't he? Emma couldn't help smiling. Fair point. The women started walking toward the supply room. Along the way, they passed several department managers preparing for the day's VIP arrival. One manager barely glanced at Grace. Another walked around her without acknowledging she existed. A third accidentally bumped her shoulder while talking into his phone. He never apologized. Grace simply stepped aside. She'd grown accustomed to making herself smaller, less noticeable, less inconvenient. Inside the linen room, shelves stretched from floor to ceiling. Fresh towels, pressed sheets, luxury bathrobes, everything perfectly organized. Grace loaded her housekeeping cart with practiced efficiency. Fold, stack, arrange. Every towel aligned exactly, every bottle facing forward, every cleaning cloth color-coded. Someone watching might have mistaken the routine for ordinary work. But Grace approached every room as though someone she loved might be checking in next. She believed dignity lived in details, even if nobody noticed, especially if nobody noticed. Around 8 o'clock, Richard Collins entered the housekeeping department unexpectedly. Conversation stopped immediately. Everyone straightened. Richard surveyed the room like a military commander inspecting troops. Listen carefully. His voice echoed against concrete walls. Mr. William Carter arrives this afternoon. You already know what's at stake. I expect perfection. His eyes moved slowly across the room. Guests should never see housekeeping. He paused deliberately. If they do, you're doing something wrong. Grace lowered her eyes. She'd heard the speech before. Invisible. Again. Richard continued. Use service elevators, service hallways. No carts in the main lobby after noon. If I see anyone wandering where they don't belong. He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't have to. Everyone understood. As Richard turned to leave, his gaze briefly landed on Grace. Only for a second, just long enough for her to feel it. Then he walked away without saying a word. Silence settled over the room again. One younger housekeeper quietly whispered, "Sometimes I think he'd rather pretend we don't exist." No one answered. Because everyone knew she was right. Late that morning, Grace worked her way through the executive floor. She changed linens, restocked coffee stations, polished mirrors until they reflected sunlight like still water. One elderly guest accidentally dropped a prescription bottle in the hallway. Before anyone else noticed, Grace knelt beside him, helping gather every tiny pill that had rolled beneath nearby furniture. "Thank you," the gentleman said warmly. "My knees don't bend the way they used to." Grace smiled. "Mine won't either someday." The man chuckled. "You've got a kind heart." Grace simply handed him the bottle. "I hope someone would do the same for me." She continued down the hallway before he could say anything else. Acts of kindness didn't require applause. They only required opportunity. By early afternoon, rain clouds gathered over Charleston. Thunder rolled softly in the distance. Inside the hotel, tension steadily increased. Managers hurried through hallways carrying folders. Fresh flowers appeared in every lobby arrangement. Polished silver trays reflected warm afternoon light. Grace watched the transformation quietly. Luxury had always fascinated her. Not because she wanted it, because she cleaned it. She knew every hidden corner behind elegance, every service hallway guests never saw, every employee entrance tucked behind beautiful architecture. Sometimes she wondered if people like her were treated the same way. Necessary, but hidden. She shook the thought away. There was still work to finish. As she guided her cart toward the east corridor, she had no idea that somewhere across town, William Carter's convoy had already begun driving toward the Grand Lexington. And by sunset, the invisible woman carrying fresh towels through silent hallways would become the one person no one inside the hotel could afford to ignore. By the time Grace Johnson clocked out, the rain had settled into a slow, steady rhythm that washed Charleston in silver. The sidewalks glimmered beneath the streetlights, and every passing car left ripples across puddles that reflected the city's historic buildings like watercolor paintings. She adjusted the hood of her light jacket and stepped away from the employee entrance, grateful that another shift had come to an end. Her feet ached, her shoulders were sore, but what weighed on her most wasn't physical exhaustion. It was Richard Collins' words from earlier. Guests should never see housekeeping. Invisible. The word lingered inside her mind long after she'd left the hotel. She walked toward the nearest bus stop, passing expensive restaurants where couples laughed over candlelit dinners and tourists wandered beneath colorful awnings, admiring Charleston's timeless beauty. Only a few blocks away, the scenery changed. The boutique storefronts gave way to quieter streets. Traffic became lighter. The rain fell harder. Grace pulled her jacket tighter around herself. She was almost at the bus stop when something unusual caught her attention. An elderly man sat alone beneath the small shelter. He looked to be in his late 60s. His charcoal overcoat was damp around the shoulders, and a leather overnight bag rested beside his polished shoes. Unlike everyone else waiting for transportation, he wasn't looking at a phone. He simply stared at the rain. Still, patient, almost defeated. Grace slowed her pace. People continued walking past him without a second glance. A young businessman hurried by while speaking into a wireless headset. A couple rushed toward a nearby parking garage. A taxi drove straight past the stop. No one seemed to notice the older man sitting quietly beneath the leaking roof. Grace almost kept walking herself. She was tired. Her aunt would be waiting for dinner. The refrigerator at home held just enough groceries for the evening. Every dollar mattered. Every minute mattered. But then, the man leaned forward and rubbed his hands together. Not dramatically. Just enough for Grace to notice he was cold. She stopped. For a brief moment she argued with herself. Maybe someone else will help him. Maybe he's waiting for family. Maybe he doesn't want company. Then another gust of wind carried rain sideways beneath the shelter. The man instinctively shifted farther onto the bench. Grace sighed softly. Some habits were stronger than common sense. She walked toward him. "Excuse me, sir." The man looked up. His blue eyes were tired but alert. "Yes? You all right?" He offered an embarrassed smile. "I've had better afternoons." Grace smiled gently. "Mind if I ask what happened?" The man hesitated before answering. "I seem to have misplaced my wallet." And unfortunately, he lifted a phone with a completely black screen. "My battery died about an hour ago." Grace looked around. "No one came with you?" "I was meeting someone." He chuckled quietly. Apparently life had other plans. There was something strangely calm about him. Most people would have been angry, frustrated, embarrassed. He simply accepted the inconvenience as though delays were part of life. Grace noticed his overnight bag. Are you visiting Charleston? For business. Anyone expecting you? I imagine several people are. He smiled again. But at the moment, he glanced toward the empty street. I couldn't tell them where I am, even if I wanted to. Grace nodded slowly. She understood. Being stranded wasn't always dramatic. Sometimes it was simply lonely. Across the street sat a small neighborhood cafe. Its windows glowed warmly against the gray afternoon. She looked toward it, then back at the man. Have you eaten today? He seemed surprised by the question. Not since breakfast. Grace reached into her purse. Inside were 3 $20 bills. 1 $10. A few singles. That money needed to last until payday. She quietly counted it once, then closed her wallet. I'll be right back. Oh, miss. You don't have to. She smiled. I know. 5 minutes later, she returned carrying 2 paper cups of hot coffee and a small bag containing 2 grilled turkey sandwiches. The rich smell of fresh bread drifted into the rainy air. The man's eyes widened. You bought all this? It wasn't much. You didn't have to. I know. She handed him 1 sandwich. He accepted it carefully, almost respectfully. For several moments they ate in comfortable silence while rain tapped softly against the metal roof above them. Finally the man spoke. You're coming home from work? Grace nodded. The Grand Lexington. The hotel? Housekeeping. You enjoy it? Grace considered the question. I enjoy taking care of people. He noticed she hadn't answered the part about the job. You've worked there long? Almost 4 years. And before that? A few different places. She smiled faintly. Nothing very exciting. He studied her for a moment. You strike me as someone who could probably do many different things. Grace laughed softly. You don't even know me. Sometimes people tell you who they are without realizing it. She looked puzzled. You bought food for a complete stranger. He held up the sandwich. Most people would have walked right past. Grace shrugged. My aunt always says kindness costs less than regret. He smiled. She sounds wise. She is. Another silence settled between them. The rain eased slightly. Cars continued passing. Still no taxi stopped. The man looked toward his lifeless phone. I hate asking. Grace interrupted him gently. You need to make a call. He nodded. If possible. She immediately unlocked her own phone. Here. He hesitated. You don't even know me. Grace smiled. I know enough. He accepted the phone. Instead of making multiple calls, he dialed only 1 number. The conversation lasted less than a minute. His voice remained calm. I'm all right? No. Don't worry. I'll stay where I am. Yes. Thank you. He handed the phone back. Much appreciated. They're coming? They are. Grace glanced at her watch. She was already running later than usual. Her aunt would probably worry. Still, something inside her refused to leave. I'll wait with you. You don't have to. I know. He laughed quietly. You seem to say that a lot. My aunt says people usually know what's right. They just need someone to remind them. The man looked thoughtfully at Grace. You know, I've spent my life around successful people, powerful people, wealthy people. He looked down at the coffee cup, warming his hands. But moments like this, they're surprisingly rare. Grace smiled. I don't think kindness has much to do with money. No. He nodded slowly. I don't suppose it does. 10 minutes later, a black SUV quietly pulled up beside the curb. A man in a dark suit stepped out immediately. Relief flooded his face the moment he spotted the older gentleman. There you are. I've been searching everywhere. The older man stood. My apologies. My phone died. The suited man looked toward Grace. And this is... The older gentleman answered before Grace could. A very kind woman. The suited man extended his hand. Thank you for staying with him. Grace shook it politely. It wasn't a problem. The older gentleman reached into his coat as though looking for something. His wallet still wasn't there. He smiled awkwardly. I'm afraid I can't properly thank you tonight. Grace stepped back. You already did. How? You let me help. For the first time all afternoon, the older man's composure cracked, just slightly. He looked at her with genuine admiration. What is your name? Grace. Grace Johnson. He repeated it quietly, as though committing it to memory. Grace. A fitting name. She smiled politely. Take care of yourself. You too. She turned and walked toward her neighborhood without ever asking who he was. Without asking what he did. Without expecting anything. The older man remained standing beside the SUV until she disappeared around the corner. The suited driver spoke quietly. Should we go, sir? The man never took his eyes off the empty sidewalk. Yes. After several moments, he added almost to himself, there are still people like her. The SUV slowly pulled away into the rainy Charleston evening. Grace never looked back. She had no idea the man she'd just spent an hour helping wasn't simply a traveler stranded by bad luck. Nor did she know that tomorrow he would walk through the front doors of the Grand Lexington, and every executive in the building would be waiting to impress him, including the manager who believed people like Grace were best kept out of sight. She arrived home nearly an hour later than usual. The porch light was already on. Aunt Evelyn opened the front door before Grace even reached the steps. I was starting to worry. Grace smiled apologetically. I stopped to help someone. Evelyn looked at her for a long moment before laughing softly. Of course you did. Grace lowered her head with a shy smile. I couldn't just leave him there. I know. Evelyn wrapped an arm gently around her shoulders. Come inside. Dinner's getting cold. As Grace stepped into the warmth of their little apartment, neither woman realized that the quiet decision made beneath a leaking bus stop had already changed the course of countless lives. Sometimes destiny doesn't announce itself with applause. Sometimes it arrives soaking wet, holding an empty phone, waiting to see whether anyone will stop. Grace slept deeply that night, unaware that the quiet encounter beneath the rain-soaked bus shelter had already become a conversation inside someone else's world. By sunrise, Charleston looked completely different. The storm had washed the streets clean. Morning light spilled across the harbor, painting the church steeples in shades of gold, while delivery trucks rolled through the historic district carrying fresh flowers, linens, and produce to the city's luxury hotels. Grace was already on the employee bus. She sat beside the window with a travel mug of coffee balanced carefully in her hands, watching the city wake one block at a time. Construction crews gathered around food trucks, Restaurant owners unlocked front doors. Joggers followed the Battery waterfront beneath oak trees draped with Spanish moss. Everything felt ordinary. She preferred ordinary. Ordinary meant bills were paid. Ordinary meant Aunt Evelyn had another day. Ordinary meant life, while difficult, remained predictable. She smiled faintly. Yesterday's stranger had probably made it safely to wherever he was going. She hoped he found his wallet. That was the last thought she gave him. When Grace stepped through the employee entrance at the Grand Lexington, she immediately sensed something different. People weren't talking. They were rushing. Housekeeping carts moved faster than usual. Managers walked with clipboards pressed against their chests. Fresh floral arrangements lined every hallway. Even the scent inside the lobby had changed. White lilies. Cedarwood. Fresh citrus. Someone had ordered an entirely new fragrance package overnight. Emma Rodriguez hurried toward her carrying a stack of room assignments. There you are. Morning. Emma barely smiled. We're behind already. Grace accepted the clipboard. Everything all right? Emma looked over both shoulders before answering. The investor arrives in less than 2 hours. I heard. No. Emma lowered her voice. I mean, everybody's losing their minds. Grace couldn't help smiling. They'll survive. I wish I believed that. Emma sighed. Richard's been walking every floor since 6 this morning, as if summoned by his name. Richard Collins rounded the corner. His posture was perfectly straight. His suit looked even sharper than yesterday, but the calm confidence he'd worn during William Carter's arrival had disappeared. Today, he looked like a man trying to hold together 100 moving pieces with only 2 hands. He stopped the moment he saw Grace. Johnson. Yes, sir. Where were you yesterday evening? Grace blinked. I had finished my shift. What time did you leave the property? She thought for a moment. About 5. Richard narrowed his eyes. 5? I believe so. He glanced down at the printed schedule in his hand. The east corridor wasn't completed until almost 6. Grace looked confused. I finished every assigned room. You disappeared. No, sir. I clocked out after finishing my list. Richard turned another page. The evening supervisor couldn't locate you. Grace suddenly understood. She had stayed at the bus stop. Longer than she'd planned. I left after my shift. Richard crossed his arms. And where exactly did you go? Grace hesitated. I stopped to help someone. Richard stared at her. You. What? A gentleman needed assistance. His expression hardened immediately. You delayed your departure to help a stranger. Yes, sir. He laughed once. Not because it was funny, because he couldn't believe what he was hearing. This isn't a charity organization, Ms. Johnson. I understand. You had responsibilities. I completed them. You had professional expectations. I know. And instead, he shook his head. You chose to spend your evening playing social worker. Several nearby employees quietly lowered their eyes. Nobody wanted to be seen listening. Grace remained calm. He needed help. Richard took one slow step closer. And if every employee decided to disappear whenever they found someone needing help? Grace answered honestly. I don't think many people stopped. Those words landed harder than she intended. For just a second, Richard didn't respond. Then irritation returned. That's not the point. He pulled a disciplinary form from his folder. I'm issuing a written warning. Grace accepted the paper without protest. Emma looked stunned. Richard. He silenced her with a glance. The employee handbook requires staff to remain available until fully released by supervisors. I had already clocked out, Grace said quietly. You were still on company property. I understand. I don't think you do. Richard handed her a pen. Sign it. Emma looked at Grace, silently hoping she'd defend herself. She didn't. Grace simply signed her name. Richard took the paper back. One more incident like this. He folded the document carefully, and we'll have to reconsider your future here. He turned and walked away. The hallway remained silent long after his footsteps disappeared. Emma looked at Grace. You know you could have explained. I did. No. Emma shook her head. You could have told him why. Grace smiled sadly. I did what anyone should have done. Emma sighed, but not everyone would. Grace carefully placed the warning notice into her apron pocket. I know. The morning continued. Room after room. Fresh towels. Vacuum lines perfectly straight across expensive carpets. Tiny bottles arranged beside polished marble sinks. Grace worked exactly the way she always had. If anything, she worked even more carefully. Around 10:30, she entered Suite 512. An elderly woman stood beside the window, struggling to lift a heavy suitcase onto the luggage rack. Oh. I'm sorry. The guest smiled apologetically. I thought I could manage. Grace immediately set down her supply basket. Please, let me. Within seconds, the suitcase was safely in place. The woman smiled warmly. Thank you. My husband usually does that. Grace noticed a framed photograph on the nightstand. An older gentleman smiling beside the same woman during what looked like a fishing trip. I'm sorry, Grace said softly. The woman nodded. He passed away last spring. Silence settled gently between them. I still catch myself talking to him. Grace smiled with quiet understanding. I don't think that ever really stops. The woman looked at her. You've lost someone too. Grace nodded once. My mother. I'm sorry, so am I. The guest reached into her purse. I'd like to tip you. Grace gently shook her head. You already have. What do you mean? You reminded me what love looks like. The woman stared for a moment before tears filled her eyes. Grace quietly returned to her work. No audience, no recognition, just another moment of kindness that would never appear on a performance review. Downstairs, the atmosphere became almost electric. Black SUVs began arriving. Security personnel quietly positioned themselves near entrances. Department heads adjusted uniforms one final time. Richard checked his watch every 30 seconds. His assistant hurried toward him. Mr. Collins, the convoy just crossed Meeting Street. Richard nodded sharply. Everyone in position. Then his eyes landed across the lobby. Grace. She had just finished replacing fresh flowers near the grand staircase. She pushed her housekeeping cart toward the east corridor. Richard felt his stomach tighten. Not again. He walked quickly across the marble floor. Grace. She stopped immediately. Yes, sir? I thought I made myself perfectly clear yesterday. She looked confused. I don't understand. No housekeeping staff in the main lobby. I'm heading back to the service hall. Then hurry. She nodded. I'm sorry. Richard looked around nervously. You've already received one warning. I know. So don't give me another reason. Grace quietly turned her cart. Its wheels rolled softly across the polished marble. She disappeared behind the service doors just as the first black SUV pulled beneath the hotel's entrance. Richard exhaled. Perfect timing. One problem avoided. Or so he believed. Outside, William Carter stepped from the vehicle. He looked toward the hotel entrance with calm confidence. Then, almost instinctively, his eyes drifted toward the service hallway. Just for a second. Long enough to notice the gray housekeeping cart disappearing behind the closing door. His expression changed almost imperceptibly. One of his executives noticed. Something wrong, Bill? William answered quietly. No. Then, after another thoughtful pause, I've seen that walk before. The executive looked puzzled. What do you mean? William never answered. Instead, he straightened his coat, buttoned the front, and walked toward the entrance where Richard Collins stood smiling beneath polished brass chandeliers, completely unaware that the woman he'd worked so hard to hide had already become the person William Carter wanted to understand. Because sometimes, the people standing in the brightest light tell you the least about an organization, and the people quietly disappearing through the service door tell you everything. Richard Collins welcomed William Carter into the Grand Lexington with the confidence of a man determined to erase every flaw before anyone else could notice it. Mr. Carter, he said warmly, extending his hand once again. We've been looking forward to your visit for weeks. William returned the handshake with a courteous smile. I appreciate the hospitality. The lobby seemed almost frozen around them. Bellmen stood perfectly still. The concierge maintained a pleasant expression that had clearly been practiced. Even the pianist slowed his tempo as the billionaire crossed the marble floor beneath the towering chandeliers. Everything appeared flawless. Richard intended to keep it that way. This way, please. He led William toward the grand staircase while speaking effortlessly about the hotel's nearly century-long history. The Grand Lexington first opened its doors in 1928. William nodded politely. Beautiful architecture. We've invested heavily in preserving its original character. I can see that. Richard smiled. The details matter. They always do, William replied. But as they continued walking, William wasn't studying the architecture nearly as carefully as Richard imagined. His attention wandered. Not toward the polished marble, not toward the crystal chandeliers, toward people. He noticed a maintenance employee quietly holding an elevator for an elderly guest before disappearing through another hallway. He noticed a restaurant hostess adjusting a dining chair for a gentleman using a cane. He noticed two housekeepers waiting patiently behind a service door until guests had passed. Richard interpreted William's silence as admiration. In reality, William was observing something else entirely. The culture. Cultures couldn't be polished overnight. Neither could respect. Inside the executive lounge, coffee had already been prepared. Fresh pastries rested beneath glass covers. Sunlight streamed through floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Charleston Harbor. Richard invited everyone to sit. I thought we'd begin with a brief overview of our expansion strategy. William rested his leather notebook on the table. Before we discuss expansion, he looked out the window for a moment. I'd like to understand your people. Richard blinked. Our people? Your employees. Richard smiled politely. We have excellent staff. I'm sure you do. William folded his hands. How long have most of them stayed with the hotel? Richard answered quickly. Our management team has exceptional retention. William nodded. I'm glad to hear that. He paused. What about housekeeping? Richard hesitated almost imperceptibly. They experience a little more turnover. A little? Our industry is demanding. William looked toward one of his own executives, who quietly wrote something inside a notebook. What percentage? Richard searched his memory. I'd estimate perhaps 30% annually. The executive quietly corrected him. Our research indicates 46. Richard's smile tightened. There was some restructuring, I'm sure. William's tone remained calm. What do exit interviews usually reveal? Richard hadn't expected that question. They often pursue other opportunities. William tilted his head slightly. What opportunities? Richard hesitated. I couldn't say specifically. You don't review the interviews personally. Our human resources department manages that. I see. Silence settled over the room. Not uncomfortable, just revealing. William accepted a cup of coffee from an assistant. Do you know every employee's name? Richard laughed politely. We employ nearly 200 people. So, no. William nodded thoughtfully. I understand. He took a slow sip before asking another question. Tell me about someone who works here. Richard smiled again. Our executive chef has won numerous awards. William gently shook his head. No, I mean someone whose work most guests never notice. Richard frowned. I'm not sure I understand. A housekeeper, a maintenance technician, a dishwasher. Someone whose absence would matter more than their presence. Richard sat quietly for a second. Names came to mind. Managers, department heads, supervisors. But not a single housekeeper. Not immediately. William noticed. So, he said quietly, you don't know. Richard shifted slightly in his chair. We have many dedicated employees. I'm sure you do. But I asked about one. The room fell silent again. William wasn't asking impossible questions. He wasn't discussing financial forecasts, or occupancy rates, or projected revenue. He was asking whether the man leading the hotel truly knew the people carrying it every day. The answer was becoming increasingly obvious. Richard quickly redirected the conversation. Our employee satisfaction surveys remain competitive. William smiled politely. I wasn't asking about surveys. He looked directly at Richard. I was asking about people. The sentence landed with surprising weight. One of Richard's assistant managers quietly looked down at the conference table. Another adjusted his glasses without speaking. William continued. In my experience, the way an organization treats the people with the least authority usually predicts how it will eventually treat everyone else. Richard nodded. I agree completely. William studied him. Do you? Before Richard could answer, an assistant entered quietly. Mr. Collins? Richard turned. Yes? The luncheon arrangements are ready whenever you are. Excellent. Richard stood. Our chef has prepared a menu featuring local low-country cuisine. William rose politely. I look forward to it. As the group exited the conference room, William intentionally slowed his pace. One of his executives quietly walked beside him. You seem unusually interested in staffing. William smiled faintly. I'm interested in leadership. They're related. The executive nodded. You think something's wrong here? William looked toward the hallway where employees quietly moved between service doors. I don't know yet. But I've learned something over the years. The fastest way to understand a company isn't by listening to executives. It's by watching how invisible people are treated. Meanwhile, 3 floors below, Grace Johnson was replacing fresh towels in Southside Room 734. The guest had already checked out. Morning sunlight stretched across the carpet in long golden rectangles. She carefully folded the final blanket and stepped back. Everything looked exactly right. She smiled to herself. There was satisfaction in leaving something better than she'd found it, even if no one ever noticed. Her radio crackled. Grace. It was Emma. Can you stop by storage before lunch? Sure. We're running low on king-size sheets. On my way. Grace pushed her cart toward the service elevator. As the doors opened, she found herself sharing the ride with Marcus Bennett, the hotel's 60-year-old maintenance supervisor. Marcus balanced a toolbox in one hand and smiled warmly. Morning, Grace. Morning. You surviving today? She laughed softly. So far. Marcus noticed the folded disciplinary notice sticking slightly from her apron pocket. That doesn't look good. Grace glanced down. It's nothing. Marcus wasn't convinced. Richard? She nodded. Marcus sighed deeply. He forgets something. What? The people who make a place shine usually aren't the ones standing under the chandeliers. Grace smiled. You always know the right thing to say. Marcus shrugged. Comes with getting old. The elevator doors opened. Marcus started walking before stopping. Oh, I almost forgot. What? I heard one of Carter's executives asking where housekeeping keeps its supplies. Grace looked surprised. Why? Marcus shrugged. No idea. Struck me as unusual. Grace thought little of it. Executives asked strange questions all the time. Marcus continued down the hallway. Grace pushed her cart toward the linen room. Neither realized that William Carter's questions were only beginning. Because while Richard Collins spent the afternoon trying to impress one of the richest men in America, William had quietly decided he wasn't looking for polished presentations anymore. He was looking for truth. And experience had taught him something simple. Truth rarely introduced itself from behind the head table. It usually arrived wearing a name tag, pushing a housekeeping cart, or quietly disappearing through a service hallway no executive ever thought to walk. The luncheon had been planned down to the smallest detail. Crystal glasses caught the afternoon sunlight. Fresh white roses stood at the center of every table. Silverware reflected the soft amber glow of antique chandeliers hanging from the ceiling of the Grand Lexington's private dining room. Richard Collins had rehearsed this part dozens of times. The chef would introduce each course. The sommelier would explain every wine pairing. After dessert, the investment presentation would begin. Everything would flow exactly as planned, or so he believed. William Carter pulled out his chair but didn't immediately sit. Instead, he slowly walked toward the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Charleston Harbor. Cargo ships drifted across the water. Sailboats rocked gently in the breeze. For several seconds, No one spoke. Finally, William turned. "It's beautiful." Richard smiled. "One of the reasons we're confident this property has tremendous long-term value." William nodded. "I'm sure it does." Then he sat. "So, I have another question." Richard felt his shoulders tighten. "Of course." William looked around the room. "How often do your executives eat with housekeeping?" Silence. Not awkward at first, simply unexpected. Richard forced a polite laugh. "I'm afraid our schedules don't always allow," William gently interrupted. "I didn't ask whether schedules allow it. I asked how often it happens." No one answered. William wasn't being confrontational. His voice remained calm. His expression stayed relaxed. That somehow made the question even more uncomfortable. One of Carter Hospitality's vice presidents quietly looked toward Richard. Another continued writing notes. Richard finally cleared his throat. "Our departments operate independently." "I see." William folded his napkin across his lap. "So your cooks rarely eat with servers. Your managers rarely speak with housekeeping. Your executives don't really know maintenance." Richard hesitated. "Large organizations naturally develop structure." "They do," William agreed. "But structure isn't the same thing as distance." The first course arrived. Roasted tomato bisque with basil cream. Servers placed bowls in perfect synchronization. Normally, Richard loved this moment. Today, no one seemed interested in the soup. William thanked the server warmly. "What is your name?" The young woman looked surprised. "Emily, sir." "How long have you worked here, Emily?" "Almost 3 years. And do you enjoy it?" She smiled honestly. "I do." "What keeps you here?" Emily glanced toward Richard before answering. "My co-workers." William smiled. That's usually the right answer. As Emily walked away, William quietly watched the interaction between the servers. One young waiter accidentally bumped another while carrying a tray. Before the tray could slip, the second employee caught it with one hand. Both smiled. Neither blamed the other. William noticed. Richard never did. The meal continued. The chef proudly described locally sourced seafood, fresh herbs grown less than 20 miles away, historic Southern recipes updated for modern fine dining. William complimented everything. The food truly was exceptional. Then, between courses, he asked another question. Who decides employee promotions? Richard answered immediately. Our Executive Review Committee. And how do they identify talent? We evaluate performance. William nodded. What kind of performance? Attendance, efficiency, guest feedback. William looked thoughtful. And kindness? Richard frowned slightly. I'm sorry. Do you evaluate kindness? Richard wasn't sure how to answer. It's difficult to measure. William smiled faintly. So are leadership and integrity, but they matter. Richard nodded politely. Certainly. William looked around the elegant dining room. I've purchased many hotels over the years. Some were profitable, some weren't. But I've noticed something. He paused. The most successful properties almost always have one thing in common. Richard leaned forward. What is it? William's answer came quietly. The people cleaning the rooms smile the same way the people running the board meetings do. No one spoke. Richard tried to process the statement. It wasn't about financial strategy or occupancy rates. It wasn't even about luxury. It was about culture. William continued. If your frontline employees are exhausted, afraid, or feel invisible, guests eventually feel it. You can't hide culture behind expensive furniture. Richard smiled politely, though his confidence had begun to slip. We work very hard to create a positive environment. I'm sure you do. William's tone remained gentle, but positive for whom? Another silence. This one lasted longer. Outside the dining room, Grace pushed a housekeeping cart toward the executive floor. She never imagined her name was only minutes away from entering conversations she wasn't supposed to hear. Inside room 918, she replaced fresh towels while soft jazz drifted through hidden ceiling speakers. Every movement remained calm, every corner carefully inspected. She noticed a business jacket folded carelessly across a chair. Without hesitation, she brushed away a small piece of lint before hanging it neatly inside the closet. No one had asked her to. The guest might never notice. That didn't matter. To Grace, doing something well had never depended on whether someone was watching. As she finished making the bed, her radio crackled. Grace? Emma again. Can you stop by the employee lounge when you're finished? Sure. We've got extra bottled water. Everyone's been running non-stop. Grace smiled. I'll grab some. 20 minutes later, she entered the employee lounge. The room couldn't have been more different from the hotel's grand dining room. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. Plastic tables showed years of scratches. Coffee stained one corner of the counter. Yet laughter filled the space. Marcus Bennett sat eating a sandwich while reading yesterday's newspaper. Two laundry attendants joked about football. Emma poured coffee into paper cups. Grace picked up a bottle of water. Marcus looked up. You surviving the circus upstairs? She laughed, barely. Emma shook her head. I've never seen management this nervous. Marcus smiled knowingly. Money does funny things to people. It sure does, Emma replied. Grace opened her water bottle. I hope the meeting goes well. Marcus looked at her curiously. Even after Richard wrote you up? Grace shrugged. If the hotel succeeds, all of us benefit. Emma stared at her. Honestly, don't know how you think that way. Grace smiled. My aunt says bitterness charges interest. Marcus laughed so hard he nearly dropped his sandwich. I like your aunt. So do I. The room fell comfortably quiet. Outside, luxury guests crossed polished marble floors. Inside, employees shared homemade cookies someone had brought from church. Different worlds. Same building. Upstairs, dessert was finally served. Charleston pecan pie with bourbon caramel. Richard sensed the difficult questions were ending. He relaxed slightly. Perhaps now they could finally discuss investment opportunities. William placed his fork down. I have one final question before the presentation. Richard forced another smile. Of course. William looked directly at him. If I walked into your employee break room right now, whose name would everyone there mention first? Richard answered automatically. Probably yours. William shook his head. No. I didn't ask who has authority. I asked who has earned trust. The room came perfectly still. Richard searched for an answer. General managers, department heads, supervisors. None felt right. For the first time all afternoon, He realized he genuinely didn't know. William noticed that too. Quietly, without embarrassment, without accusation, simply as another piece of information. He leaned back in his chair. I think, before we discuss buildings, I'd like to meet the people inside them. Richard blinked. You'd like to meet department heads? William smiled. No. I've already met those. I'd like to meet someone whose name doesn't appear on today's presentation. Richard's heartbeat quickened. What sort of employee? William looked toward the window, watching a housekeeping cart roll across the courtyard below. Someone easy to overlook. Someone who keeps this place running, even if nobody ever thanks them. Richard followed William's gaze. Down below, Grace pushed her cart across the service walkway, completely unaware that the most important man in the building had just asked to meet someone exactly like her. And for the first time that afternoon, Richard Collins felt something he hadn't experienced in years. Not pressure, not stress. Fear. Because he suddenly realized he had spent an entire career learning how to impress powerful people. He had never learned how to truly see the quiet ones. Richard Collins remained standing beside the conference table long after William Carter's words settled over the room. No one reached for the presentation remote. No one opened the leather portfolios stacked neatly in front of each executive. The silence itself had become part of the meeting. William calmly folded his reading glasses and slipped them into the inside pocket of his jacket. I believe we've discussed enough numbers for now. Richard forced another professional smile. Certainly. We can move on to the financial projections whenever you're ready. William gently shook his head. Not yet. He glanced toward his senior advisor. I'd like to meet someone. Richard immediately brightened. Absolutely. I can introduce you to our executive chef, our director of guest relations, or our operations. No. William interrupted politely. I've already met your leadership. His voice remained calm. I'd like to meet someone whose name wasn't printed in today's agenda. Richard's confidence faded again. I'm not sure I understand. William leaned back comfortably. I asked earlier who earns the trust of the people working here. You didn't have an answer. Richard felt every pair of eyes turn toward him. William continued. So perhaps we'll let your employees answer for us. One of Richard's assistant managers shifted uneasily in his chair. What exactly do you mean, Mr. Carter? William smiled. I'd like one employee chosen by the staff. No preparation, no coaching, no speeches. Just someone they respect. Richard hesitated. We usually follow a more structured protocol during investment visits. I'm aware. William nodded. I'm suggesting something different. The room fell quiet again. Richard looked toward his executive team. No one volunteered a solution. Finally, he pressed the intercom button beside his chair. Linda? His assistant answered immediately. Yes, Mr. Collins. I need Emma Rodriguez from housekeeping and Marcus Bennett from maintenance. They're to come upstairs immediately. Yes, sir. Richard released the button. William noticed. You trust those two? They supervise our largest support departments. William smiled. We'll see who they trust. Downstairs, Emma Rodriguez was checking inventory when her radio crackled. Emma. She picked it up. Go ahead. Mr. Collins needs you in Executive Conference Room A. Emma frowned. Now. Immediately. She looked across the linen room. Grace was folding fresh towels. Marcus Bennett had just entered carrying a replacement light fixture. Emma sighed. This can't be good. Marcus chuckled. When management says immediately, it never is. A few minutes later, both of them entered the executive hallway. The thick carpet muffled every footstep. Large oil paintings lined the walls. Outside conference room A stood two hotel assistants who quietly opened the doors. Emma immediately sensed the tension inside. William Carter sat at the head of the table. Richard stood beside him. Several executives looked unusually uncomfortable. Richard gestured politely. Emma. Marcus, please have a seat. Neither of them did. Emma folded her hands. You needed us? William answered before Richard could. I did. His tone was warm. You've both worked here quite a while. Marcus smiled. 22 years. Emma nodded. Almost 15. William looked genuinely interested. Then you know the people. We try to. I'd like your help. Of course. If you had to name one employee this hotel could least afford to lose, who would it be? Emma and Marcus exchanged a quick glance. Neither answered immediately. Not because they didn't know, because they both knew. Marcus smiled first. I think we're thinking about the same person. Emma nodded slowly. I believe we are. Richard watched them carefully. His curiosity grew. William leaned forward. Who? Emma answered without hesitation. Grace Johnson. The room became still. Richard blinked. The housekeeper? Marcus nodded. Yes. William looked toward Richard, but said nothing. Richard spoke first. Grace is dependable. Emma looked surprised. Dependable? Marcus couldn't help smiling. That's one word for it. William quietly asked, Tell me about her. Emma folded her hands. She volunteers to cover extra shifts, never complains. If someone calls in sick, Grace usually stays. Marcus added, Last winter one of our maintenance guys slipped on the loading dock. Grace stayed with him until the ambulance arrived. She missed her own bus getting home. Emma continued. She remembers guests' preferences. She notices when someone looks lonely. She leaves handwritten welcome notes for anniversary couples. Richard looked confused. Welcome notes? Emma nodded. Anonymous. We found out later they were hers. William listened without interrupting. Marcus smiled to himself. Couple years ago, the dishwasher quit halfway through a holiday banquet. Grace stayed 4 extra hours helping wash dishes. No overtime requested. No recognition. She just said people deserved hot meals. Richard stared. I never heard about that. Marcus answered quietly. Exactly. William noticed the exchange. What else? Emma looked thoughtful. She brings homemade soup for employees who get sick. She donates vacation days. She remembers everyone's birthdays. Marcus laughed. I forget my own birthday. Grace doesn't. William's expression softened. And what position does she hold? Richard answered. Housekeeping. William looked directly at him. Only housekeeping? Richard hesitated. Yes. Emma quietly corrected him. No. Everyone looked toward her. She smiled gently. Officially? Housekeeping. In reality? She's the heartbeat of this place. Silence followed. Richard lowered his eyes. William broke it. "I'd like to meet Ms. Johnson." Richard instinctively answered, "Of course." Then something crossed his mind. His stomach tightened. Grace. The warning. Yesterday. The lobby. The bus stop incident he barely understood. For reasons he couldn't explain, uneasiness settled heavily in his chest. He pressed the intercom once more. "Linda." "Yes, Mr. Collins?" "Please ask Grace Johnson to report to conference room A." A brief pause followed. "Right away." Grace was replacing fresh flowers near the east corridor when another employee hurried toward her. "Grace?" She looked up. "Yes?" "Mr. Collins wants you upstairs." Grace frowned. "Now?" "The executive conference room." She instinctively looked down at her uniform. Gray housekeeping dress. Name badge. Cleaning gloves tucked into one pocket. "I'm still working," they said immediately. Grace's pulse quickened. She quietly set the flower bucket aside. As she rode the executive elevator alone, dozens of possibilities crossed her mind. Maybe Richard had decided the written warning wasn't enough. Maybe a guest had complained. Maybe she'd accidentally forgotten something in one of the rooms. By the time the elevator doors opened, her palms had begun to sweat. She took one slow breath, smoothed the wrinkles from her uniform, then walked toward the conference room. Inside, Richard stood waiting. William Carter remained seated. The executives quietly turned toward the door as it opened. Grace stepped inside. "I'm sorry if I've interrupted the meeting." Richard's voice sounded unusually controlled. "No, you've been requested." Grace looked confused. "Requested?" William Carter slowly stood. For the first time since arriving at the Grand Lexington, he smiled with unmistakable recognition. And in that single moment, Grace felt certain she had seen his face somewhere before. She just couldn't remember where. For several long seconds, no one in the conference room moved. Grace stood just inside the doorway, still holding the pair of white housekeeping gloves she had removed before coming upstairs. The polished walnut table stretched nearly the length of the room, surrounded by executives in tailored suits whose attention was fixed entirely on her. She suddenly became very aware of her gray housekeeping uniform, the cleaning solution on her sleeves, the comfortable shoes she'd worn through thousands of hotel hallways. She had never felt out of place inside the Grand Lexington until this moment. Richard Collins cleared his throat. "Grace." His voice carried the familiar tone of authority, but beneath it lay something unfamiliar. Nervousness. "I'd like you to meet Mr. William Carter." Grace offered a polite smile. "It's a pleasure, sir." William didn't answer immediately. Instead, he walked around the conference table until only a few feet separated them. He studied her face with quiet warmth. Then he smiled. "I believe we've already met." Grace searched his face again. The silver hair, the calm blue eyes, the gentle smile. Suddenly, the rain, the bus stop, the paper coffee cups, the empty phone. Her eyes widened. She whispered the word almost to herself. "It was you." William nodded. "Yes." The room instantly became silent. Richard looked from William to Grace, unable to understand. "You two know each other?" William answered before Grace could. "We met yesterday evening." Richard frowned. "Yesterday?" William smiled gently. "Your employee spent nearly an hour helping an old man she'd never met." Grace looked embarrassed. It really wasn't a big thing. William laughed softly. It was a very big thing. Richard's expression became increasingly confused. I'm afraid I'm missing something. William turned toward the executives. Yesterday, my driver was delayed after an unexpected scheduling problem. My phone battery died. My wallet had been misplaced. I found myself sitting alone at a bus stop in the rain. He looked back at Grace. Most people walked by. She didn't. No one interrupted. William continued. She bought me coffee. She bought me dinner. She let me use her phone. And perhaps most importantly, she never once asked who I was. Grace lowered her eyes. I didn't think it mattered. William smiled. Exactly. One of Carter Hospitality's executives quietly nodded. Richard remained frozen. His mind struggled to connect the pieces. Yesterday. Grace had been late leaving. She had admitted helping someone. He had disciplined her. He slowly looked toward the folded disciplinary report still resting inside the folder beside his chair. His stomach tightened. William noticed. Something wrong, Mr. Collins? Richard hesitated. He looked at Grace. Yesterday morning I issued Ms. Johnson a written warning. Several heads turned. William's expression didn't change. For what reason? Richard answered honestly. She remained after work without authorization. Grace quietly spoke. I finished my shift first. Richard nodded. Yes. You did. William folded his hands behind his back. And what was she doing after her shift? Richard swallowed. Helping. His voice grew quieter. You. The room seemed to shrink. No one looked away. Grace immediately spoke. It isn't his fault. Richard turned toward her in surprise. He didn't know. William glanced at Grace. You still feel the need to defend him? She answered without hesitation. He was doing what he believed was best for the hotel. Richard stared at her. After everything that had happened, after the warning, after the embarrassment, she was protecting him. William noticed it too. There it is, he said softly. Richard looked confused. What? The reason your staff chose her. Grace looked uncomfortable. Sir. William gently raised a hand. Please let me finish. He returned to the head of the room. When I arrived today, everyone wanted me to notice the building, the marble, the chandeliers, the presentation. He looked slowly around the table. But yesterday, I met the soul of this hotel. Silence settled once more. Richard lowered his eyes. William continued. I deliberately never mentioned our meeting. I wanted to see whether anyone here already knew what kind of employee Grace Johnson was. He looked toward Emma and Marcus. They did. He looked toward Richard. You didn't. Richard's face flushed. William's words weren't cruel. That somehow made them impossible to dismiss. I've spent 40 years investing in hotels. I've learned one lesson over and over. You can renovate a lobby, you can replace furniture, you can modernize guest rooms, but you cannot buy the kind of character this woman demonstrated yesterday. Grace shifted uneasily. I only helped someone. William smiled. No. You revealed something. He paused. You revealed who you are when nobody's watching. The words lingered in the room. One of Richard's assistant managers quietly removed his glasses to wipe his eyes. Emma folded her hands tightly in front of her. Marcus smiled to himself. He had known this all along. William turned back toward the Richard. Yesterday, did you ask Grace where she had gone before writing her up? Richard answered truthfully. She told me she stopped to help someone. And did you ask any further questions? Did you ask whether that person was safe? No. Did you ask whether she needed support? Richard's shoulders slowly sank. No. William nodded. I thought not. No anger. No raised voice, only disappointment. It carried more weight than shouting ever could. Grace quietly stepped forward. Mr. Carter, I truly don't want anyone getting into trouble because of me. William smiled kindly. I know. That's precisely why we're having this conversation. He looked around the conference room. Organizations don't fail because good people disappear. They fail because good people stop being noticed. Richard finally spoke. His voice sounded different now, less polished, more human. Grace. She looked at him. I'm sorry. The words seemed almost unfamiliar to him. I should have listened. Grace offered a small smile. We all have difficult days. Richard shook his head. No. This wasn't a difficult day. This was my mistake. Grace didn't answer. She simply nodded once. William watched the exchange with quiet approval. Then he reached inside his jacket and removed a small leather notebook. I've made my decision. Every executive in the room instinctively straightened. Richard's heartbeat quickened. Was this about the investment? About Grace? About both? William closed the notebook again without opening it. The future of the Grand Lexington. He looked directly at Richard. Will depend less on your business plan than on what you choose to do next. No one spoke. Outside the conference room windows, the late afternoon sun broke through the clouds for the first time since the storm. Golden light spilled across Charleston Harbor. Inside, Grace still stood wearing the same gray housekeeping uniform, but for the first time since joining the Grand Lexington, every person in the room truly saw her, and Richard Collins realized something that would stay with him for the rest of his career. The employee he'd worked hardest to keep out of sight had become the very reason his hotel still had a future. No one moved. The conference room, so carefully prepared to impress one of the most influential investors in the country, had become something entirely different. It was no longer a place for negotiations. It had become a mirror. And everyone around the table was seeing themselves more clearly than they had expected. Richard Collins slowly lowered himself into his chair. For the first time that day, he wasn't thinking about quarterly revenue, occupancy rates, or expansion plans. He was replaying dozens of moments that had seemed insignificant when they happened. Grace holding the service elevator while executives rushed past without acknowledging her. Grace quietly replacing flowers after someone else accidentally knocked over a display. Grace staying late after holiday banquets. Grace smiling every morning, even when nobody smiled back. How many times had he walked past her? Hundreds, maybe thousands. Yet he couldn't remember a single real conversation. William Carter remained standing. He wasn't interested in humiliating Richard. Humiliation rarely changed people. Understanding sometimes did. He looked around the room. I want to ask each of you something. No one interrupted. When was the last time you thanked someone whose job made your own possible? Silence answered him. The executive chef slowly looked toward the floor. The director of operations removed his glasses. Even Richard's assistant shifted uncomfortably. William continued. I don't mean thanking another executive. I mean the person who empties your trash, the person who washes your dishes, the person who fixes the air conditioner before guests notice it's broken, the person who changes sheets you'll never sleep on. His voice remained calm. If leadership only notices excellence when it's wearing a suit, then leadership is seeing very little. Emma Rodriguez glanced toward Grace. Grace wished everyone would stop looking at her. She hadn't helped William to prove a point. She hadn't expected recognition. She only wanted the meeting to end. Quietly, she said, Mr. Carter. William turned. I really don't think this should be about me. He smiled gently. I know. That's exactly why it is. Grace lowered her eyes. William walked slowly around the room. I've spent decades meeting remarkable people. Some were brilliant, some were wealthy, some were powerful. He paused beside the conference window overlooking Charleston Harbor, but very few possessed something far more valuable. He looked back toward Grace. They remained kind when nobody was watching. The room remained perfectly still. Richard finally spoke. I owe everyone here an apology. His words came slowly, without rehearsed confidence. I've always believed I was protecting this hotel. I focused on appearances. I demanded perfection. I convinced myself that details created excellence. He looked directly at Grace, but somewhere along the way, I confused appearance with value. Grace didn't answer. Richard continued. I worried about whether guests would see housekeeping, when I should have been asking whether housekeeping felt seen. Emma quietly wiped away a tear. Marcus folded his arms, giving Richard his full attention. No one had ever heard the general manager speak this way. William nodded once. That's an important distinction. Richard looked toward the disciplinary folder still resting beside him. Without saying a word, he opened it. Inside rested the written warning Grace had signed that morning. He stared at it for several seconds. Then, he slowly removed the paper, folded it once, then tore it neatly in half. Again, and again. The small pieces landed inside the recycling bin beside the conference table. Richard looked at Grace. That warning never should have existed. Grace smiled softly. You don't have to do that. I do. He shook his head. No employee should be punished for showing compassion after work. William watched quietly. This wasn't about the paper. It was about whether Richard understood why the paper had been wrong in the first place. Richard turned toward the rest of the executive team. How many talented people have we overlooked? No one answered immediately. Finally, the director of food service spoke. I honestly don't know. Marcus quietly cleared his throat. I might. Everyone turned. I've worked here 22 years. I know mechanics who speak 3 languages. I know kitchen staff with accounting degrees. I know housekeepers who trained nurses before taking these jobs. And I know people who stopped volunteering ideas because nobody ever asked. Those words settled heavily over the room. William looked intrigued. Why didn't anyone tell management? Marcus smiled sadly. They did. A long time ago. When nothing changed. They stopped trying. Richard closed his eyes briefly. That sentence hurt more than any criticism. because he believed it. Grace finally looked up. "If I may say something." William nodded. "Please." She spoke carefully. "I don't think anyone here meant to ignore people." Richard listened silently. "I think everyone became busy. Schedules, budgets, deadlines." She smiled gently. "And when people become busy, they sometimes stop seeing what's been in front of them all along." William couldn't hide his admiration. Even now, given every opportunity to condemn the people who had overlooked her, Grace chose understanding instead. That was something no resume could teach. Richard slowly stood. "Grace." She met his eyes. "I'd like to ask you something." She waited. "When you came to work every day, after being overlooked, after being underestimated, why did you keep caring so much?" The question hung in the air. Grace thought about it. She pictured Aunt Evelyn sitting at their small kitchen table. She remembered something her aunt had repeated for years. She smiled. "My aunt always says, never let another person's blindness become your way of seeing." She paused. "So I tried not to. I didn't clean rooms because someone appreciated it. I cleaned them because the next guest deserved to walk into something welcoming. I didn't help coworkers because it would earn recognition. I helped because someday I might be the one needing help." Her voice remained quiet. But kindness only works if someone starts. No one spoke. Outside, sunlight broke completely through the clouds. The rain had ended. The harbor shimmered beneath a clear blue sky. William looked toward Richard one last time. "I came here today expecting to evaluate a property." He smiled faintly. "Instead, I found an opportunity." Richard frowned slightly. "What do you mean?" William reached into his briefcase and removed a slim black notebook. "I still believe the Grand Lexington is worth investing in." Relief flickered across several faces. "But..." The room grew still again. "My investment will come with one condition." Every executive leaned forward. William closed the notebook. "The next time I visit this hotel, I don't want to hear another presentation about marble floors. I want to see a culture where people like Grace Johnson are impossible to overlook." He looked around the room. "If that happens, you won't simply have a better hotel, you'll have a better organization." Richard slowly nodded. "You have my word." William smiled. "I hope someday your employees will have it too." Grace stood quietly beside the conference room door, still wearing the same gray housekeeping uniform she'd put on before sunrise. Nothing about her appearance had changed. Yet somehow, everything had. For the first time since joining the Grand Lexington, she wasn't standing in the background of someone else's success. Without asking for it, without expecting it. She had quietly become the standard by which leadership itself would now be measured. And although no one in the room realized it yet, William Carter had one final decision to announce. One that would change not only Grace's future, but the future of every employee who had ever believed their best qualities would remain forever unseen. The conference room remained silent. No one wanted to interrupt what felt less like a business meeting and more like the beginning of something entirely new. William Carter slowly picked up his leather portfolio. He opened it carefully and removed a single sheet of paper. It wasn't a contract. It wasn't a financial report. It was a handwritten page. The ink had faded slightly from years of folding and unfolding. "I've carried this with me for almost 30 years, William said quietly. Everyone watched him. When I bought my very first hotel, I thought I understood business. He smiled to himself. I was wrong. He unfolded the paper. It came from an elderly janitor who had worked there for nearly 4 decades. William looked around the room before reading aloud. If you only invest in buildings, you'll own expensive buildings. If you invest in people, they'll build something no competitor can copy. He lowered the page. I've never forgotten those words. Richard listened without blinking. William carefully folded the paper again. I've purchased dozens of properties since then. I've renovated lobbies. I've redesigned restaurants. I've expanded luxury brands across 3 continents. But every successful investment I've ever made began the same way. He paused. By finding the people whose character couldn't be taught. His eyes settled on Grace. You are one of those people. Grace instinctively shook her head. I'm just a housekeeper. William smiled warmly. No. That's your job. It isn't who you are. Those words settled deep inside the room. For years, Grace had separated those 2 ideas herself. She had learned to introduce herself by her position, not by her character, not by her values, not by the quiet strength that had carried both her and Aunt Evelyn through difficult years. William reached into his jacket. This time he removed a simple black business card. Unlike the elegant gold cards his executives carried, this one had no title beneath his name. Only a private phone number. He walked toward Grace. Holding the card with both hands, he offered it to her. I'd like you to have this. Grace hesitated. I couldn't. You can. I haven't earned something like this. William smiled. I disagree. You earned it yesterday. When nobody was watching. Grace slowly accepted the card. Her hands trembled slightly. She looked down at the embossed letters. William Carter, private office, direct line. She had never held anything that seemed capable of changing a life. She looked back up. I don't know what to say. You don't have to say anything. But I'd like you to remember one thing. She waited. If you ever decide your gifts have outgrown this building, my door will always be open. Richard felt something tighten in his chest. Not jealousy. Regret. For 4 years, that opportunity had existed inside his own hotel. He had simply never seen it. William turned back toward the executive table. My investment committee has already completed its financial analysis. Several executives exchanged curious looks. Richard blinked. You already made your decision? William nodded. Before arriving. Richard looked surprised. Then, today's meeting. William smiled. Was never really about the building. It was about leadership. Silence. William continued. I wanted to know whether this hotel deserved the people already working inside it. Richard lowered his eyes. And? William answered honestly. I'm still deciding. The sentence struck harder than any rejection could have. Richard understood exactly what William meant. The marble floors weren't being evaluated anymore. Neither were occupancy numbers. His leadership was. After several quiet moments, Richard stood. Mr. Carter, I've spent 23 years believing that excellence came from controlling every detail. He looked toward Grace. Today I realized excellence begins with seeing people. He turned toward Emma and Marcus, and listening to them. Finally, he looked around the room. I've failed to do that. No one interrupted. I can't change the last 4 years, but I can change tomorrow morning. William watched carefully. How? Richard didn't answer immediately. Instead, he walked toward the conference room door. He opened it. Linda, his executive assistant, looked up from her desk. Could you ask Human Resources to postpone tomorrow's executive planning meeting? She looked surprised. Certainly. I'd like every department supervisor available instead. What kind of meeting? Richard smiled. The kind we should have been having years ago. Linda nodded. I'll arrange it. Richard closed the door again. Turning back toward William, he said quietly, I don't want another employee to spend years believing they're invisible. William nodded once. That's a promising place to begin. Emma suddenly spoke. May I say something? Richard smiled. Please. Emma looked toward Grace. I've supervised housekeeping for 15 years. I've watched people come and go. I've seen hard workers. I've seen talented workers. But Grace is something different. She smiled through moist eyes. People become better around her. Marcus laughed softly. That's true. If she's on shift, everybody works a little harder. Not because they're afraid, because they don't want to let her down. Grace felt her face warm. Please. You don't have to. Marcus grinned. We do. Richard looked genuinely surprised. I had no idea. Marcus answered gently, that's because you weren't looking where leadership actually lives. The room grew quiet once more. William finally spoke. I have one recommendation. Richard nodded immediately. I'm listening. Don't create a position for Grace because she impressed me. Richard frowned slightly. Then why? William smiled. Create opportunities because your employees deserve them. If Grace becomes successful, let it inspire others. But don't stop with Grace. Richard slowly nodded. I understand. William walked toward the conference room windows. Down below, dozens of employees crossed the courtyard between buildings. Housekeepers, engineers, laundry attendants, servers, gardeners, security officers. From this height, they looked small, almost anonymous. William quietly said, Every one of those people has a story. The question is whether anyone in leadership cares enough to hear it. Richard stood beside him. For several moments, both men simply watched the employees moving below. Finally, Richard spoke. I think tomorrow, I'm going to start asking. William smiled. I hope you never stop. Grace remained near the conference table, still holding the black business card. She thought about Aunt Evelyn, about overdue medical bills, about worn-out shoes, about all the job applications she'd quietly submitted over the past 4 years after finishing housekeeping shifts. She had always believed opportunity lived somewhere else, in another city, another company, another life. Now, opportunity had walked directly into the Grand Lexington. Not because she chased it, because she had stopped for someone who needed help. William looked back toward her. I'll be returning in a few months. Grace smiled politely. I hope we'll make you proud. William shook his head. I already am. The words caught her completely off guard. For a brief moment, she couldn't answer. She simply smiled through eyes beginning to glisten. Outside, late afternoon sunlight poured across the hotel's front entrance. Guests arrived. Bellmen opened doors. Housekeepers continued pushing linen carts through service hallways. The Grand Lexington looked exactly as it had that morning. But beneath the polished marble, something had shifted. Not in the building, in the people leading it. And somewhere downstairs, dozens of employees were finishing another ordinary workday, unaware that by tomorrow morning, the hotel they worked in would begin changing, because one woman had quietly proved that the greatest luxury any business could offer wasn't elegance. It was dignity. The next morning, the Grand Lexington looked exactly the way it always had. The marble floors reflected the chandeliers. Fresh flowers stood in polished brass vases. The lobby smelled faintly of white tea and cedar. Guests checked in. Bellmen loaded luggage. Housekeepers disappeared through service corridors before most visitors even noticed they were there. From the outside, nothing had changed. Inside, everything had. At precisely 8 o'clock, department supervisors gathered in the largest conference room on the executive floor. Some expected another meeting about William Carter's investment. Others assumed Richard Collins would announce new performance standards after the stressful visit. Instead, they found something unusual. There was no projector displaying financial charts, no stack of quarterly reports, no elaborate presentation, only a circle of chairs. Richard stood near the window with a simple notebook in his hands. When everyone had taken a seat, he looked around the room. "I owe each of you an apology." Several supervisors exchanged puzzled looks. Richard continued before anyone could respond. "For years, I've measured success by occupancy, revenue, guest ratings, and presentation. They matter. But yesterday reminded me that I ignored something much more important." He paused. "The people who make those numbers possible." Silence settled over the room. Emma Rodriguez watched him carefully. Marcus Bennett folded his arms, saying nothing. Richard took a slow breath. "I want to know something." He looked toward every department. "How many people working here have skills we aren't using?" Nobody answered immediately. Finally, Emma spoke. "I know 3 housekeepers who speak fluent Spanish and Portuguese." Marcus nodded. "I've got an electrician finishing an engineering degree at night." The executive chef raised his hand. "My pastry assistant taught culinary classes before moving here." One by one, stories began to emerge. A front desk clerk with a background in graphic design, a banquet server who had managed community events for years, a laundry attendant who had repaired industrial equipment before caring for an aging spouse forced him to take a different schedule. The room slowly filled with quiet surprises. Richard listened without interrupting. Each story felt like another page from a book he had never bothered to open. Finally, he asked the question that mattered most. "Why didn't I know any of this?" Marcus smiled gently. "You never asked." No one laughed. There was nothing funny about how true the answer was. Richard nodded slowly. "I won't make that mistake again." He wrote one sentence across the top of his notebook. "Know the people before judging the positions." He underlined it once, then closed the notebook. "I'd like every department to conduct voluntary talent interviews. No performance evaluations, no disciplinary records. I simply want to know who works here." Emma smiled for the first time that morning. "I think people have been waiting a long time to hear that." Meanwhile, Grace had already begun her shift. She wasn't aware of the meeting upstairs. She assumed life had returned to normal. Her cart rolled quietly through the 5th floor as morning sunlight stretched across the hallway carpet. She greeted guests with the same gentle smile she always had. She straightened paintings that had shifted slightly overnight. She replaced towels with crisp new ones. Nothing about her routine had changed, but something about the way people looked at her had. A server passing through the hallway paused. "Morning, Grace." She smiled. "Morning." The server hesitated. "I heard what happened yesterday." Grace immediately looked uncomfortable. "It really wasn't anything." "I think it was." The server smiled warmly before continuing toward the elevator. A few minutes later, another employee stopped her. Then another. Not because she had become famous, because stories traveled quickly inside hotels, especially stories that reminded people of who they wanted to be. Grace thanked each person politely. But inside, she hoped the attention would fade. She had never wanted to become the center of anything. Later that afternoon, Emma found Grace organizing supplies inside the linen room. "You got a minute?" "Of course." Emma handed her an envelope. Richard had written Grace's name himself. Grace looked puzzled. "What is it?" "I think he'd rather explain it himself." Grace frowned slightly. "Am I in trouble again?" Emma laughed. "I don't think that's possible anymore." 20 minutes later, Grace knocked gently on Richard's office door. "Come in." His office overlooked Charleston Harbor. Yesterday, she had entered the executive conference room with fear. Today, she entered with uncertainty. Richard stood as soon as she walked in. "Please, have a seat." Grace sat carefully. Richard remained standing for a moment, collecting his thoughts. "I've replayed yesterday in my mind all night." She remained silent. "I kept thinking about something." He looked toward the window. "I know the names of investors. I know market trends. I know occupancy forecasts 5 years into the future." He smiled sadly. "But until yesterday, I didn't really know Grace Johnson." She lowered her eyes. "You didn't have to." "I should have." The words hung quietly between them. Richard reached across his desk and slid a folder toward her. Grace opened it carefully. Inside was a proposal. Director of Guest Experience Development. Temporary assignment. Her eyes widened. She looked back up. "I don't understand." "I'd like you to help us. Help us understand our own people." Grace blinked. "Me?" Richard nodded. "You see things the rest of us miss. You notice people. You build trust naturally. I can't teach that." Grace looked down at the folder again. "It says temporary." "It does." "Why?" Richard smiled honestly. "Because I don't want to offer you a title. I want to earn your trust first." Grace looked at him for several seconds. Yesterday, those words might have sounded impossible coming from Richard Collins. Today, they sounded sincere. "I don't know if I'm qualified." Richard laughed softly. "Yesterday I would have said qualifications were printed on resumes. Today, I think they're revealed by choices." Grace smiled. "I'll need time. You have it." She carefully closed the folder. "There is one condition." Richard nodded immediately. "Anything. If we do this, I don't want it to be only about me." He smiled. "I was hoping you'd say that." He opened another folder. Inside were blank interview forms, employee skills, languages, education, hidden interests, career goals. "I'd like every employee to have the same opportunity." Grace looked up. Her eyes filled slightly. "Then, I'd be honored to help." Richard extended his hand. This time, not as a manager. As a partner. Grace shook it. Outside his office window, the afternoon sun reflected across Charleston Harbor like scattered pieces of gold. Down below, employees crossed the courtyard between buildings, unaware that a quiet conversation upstairs had just opened a door for every person who had ever believed their uniform defined their future. Grace left the office carrying the folder against her chest. As she stepped back into the hallway, she passed a young maintenance technician carrying a ladder. He smiled politely. She smiled back. Neither knew it yet. But within weeks, conversations like the one Grace had just experienced would begin changing lives all across the Grand Lexington. Not because one woman had been promoted, but because one act of kindness had taught an entire organization how to finally see the people who had always been standing right in front of them. 3 months passed quietly. Spring settled over Charleston with warm mornings, flowering magnolias, and a steady stream of travelers filling the Grand Lexington once again. To guests, the hotel looked much the same as it always had. The marble still gleamed beneath crystal chandeliers. Fresh flowers still welcomed visitors in the lobby. Bellmen still opened polished brass doors with practiced smiles. But beneath the surface, something profound had changed. Every Tuesday morning, Conference Room B, once reserved almost exclusively for executive meetings, filled with employees from every corner of the hotel. Housekeepers, servers, laundry attendants, maintenance technicians, front desk clerks, gardeners, kitchen assistants. Not to discuss problems, but possibilities. Grace Johnson stood near a whiteboard instead of pushing a housekeeping cart. Her title now read Director of Guest Experience Development, but she had insisted on keeping the same simple employee badge design as everyone else. Titles mattered less to her than conversations. On the wall behind her hung a simple sentence that had become the guiding principle of the entire program. See the person before the position. The room buzzed with quiet conversation. A maintenance employee described his background in electrical engineering. A banquet server volunteered to help redesign wedding packages after revealing years of experience planning nonprofit events. One housekeeper, originally from Brazil, agreed to assist international guests who spoke Portuguese. Another employee shared ideas for improving accessibility after caring for an aging parent for several years. Grace rarely spoke first. She listened. That had become her greatest responsibility. Listening. Richard Collins often attended these sessions without saying much. Instead of sitting at the head of the room, he usually chose a chair near the back. Notebook open, pen moving constantly. He had discovered something surprising. Leadership required far less talking than he had once believed. One afternoon, after another session ended, Marcus Bennett walked beside Richard through the employee hallway. "You've changed," Marcus said with an easy smile. Richard chuckled. "I've heard that a few times. I mean it as a compliment." Richard looked toward the service corridor, where several employees laughed together while changing shifts. "I used to think I knew this hotel." Marcus nodded. "You knew the building." Richard smiled quietly. "I'm finally getting to know the people." Marcus placed a hand on his shoulder. "Took you long enough." They both laughed. It felt good. Not forced, not formal, just two coworkers sharing an honest moment. Across the lobby, Grace welcomed a group of international business travelers. She greeted each guest warmly before introducing them to the concierge team. Nothing dramatic, nothing theatrical. Just quiet professionalism mixed with genuine kindness. Guests noticed. Reviews began mentioning employees by name instead of simply praising the hotel itself. One guest wrote, "I've stayed in luxury hotels around the world. This was the first one that made me feel like people genuinely cared whether I had a good day." William Carter received copies of those reviews every month. He read every one. Late one Friday afternoon, a familiar black SUV rolled beneath the Grand Lexington's entrance. No media, no announcement, no executive entourage. Just William. He stepped from the vehicle carrying only a small leather overnight bag. Richard greeted him at the entrance. "It's good to see you again." William smiled. "It's good to be back." As they entered the lobby together, William immediately noticed something different. A front desk associate greeted a housekeeper by name. A manager thanked a maintenance employee for repairing a guest elevator. Two executives stopped to help move banquet equipment rather than simply walking around it. Small moments, almost invisible, yet impossible to fake. William looked toward Richard. "You've been busy." Richard smiled. "We've been learning." William glanced across the lobby. "Where's Grace?" Before Richard could answer, they both noticed her near the revolving doors. An elderly housekeeping employee had accidentally dropped a large container of folded towels, white linens scattered across the polished floor. Several guests instinctively stepped around them. Without hesitation, Grace knelt beside the woman. "So sorry," the employee said. "My hands slipped." Grace smiled warmly. "Happens to all of us." She carefully folded each towel again instead of simply gathering them into a pile. Two nearby employees immediately joined them. Within moments, everything was back in order. No frustration, no embarrassment, only quiet teamwork. Grace helped the older employee back to her feet. "You all right?" The woman nodded. "I'm fine. Thank you." Grace squeezed her hand gently. "We look after each other." Neither woman noticed William watching. He turned toward Richard. "That's why your investment was approved." Richard blinked. "Not because of the financial projections." William smiled. "I approved those months ago." He looked back toward Grace. "I was waiting to see whether kindness had become culture." Richard followed his gaze. "It has." William nodded. "I can see that." Later that afternoon, employees gathered in the ballroom for a simple celebration. Nothing extravagant. Coffee, desserts, fresh flowers. Richard stepped onto the small stage. Months earlier, public speaking had always centered around numbers and performance. Today was different. "I spent years believing leadership meant having the right answers." He smiled toward Grace. "I've learned it begins with asking better questions." Gentle applause filled the room. Richard continued. "The Grand Lexington will continue our Hidden Talents initiative permanently." Cheers erupted across the ballroom. No employee should ever feel that their potential ends where their job description begins. Grace looked around the room. She recognized nearly every face. People who had once hurried past one another in silence now talked freely across departments. Housekeepers laughed with executives. Engineers exchanged ideas with concierge staff. The invisible lines separating people had begun to disappear. William quietly stood near the back of the ballroom, content to remain unnoticed. Grace eventually found him. "I never really thanked you." William smiled. "For what?" "For seeing me." He gently shook his head. "I didn't." She looked puzzled. "I simply noticed what was already there." Grace smiled. "My aunt always says people become who others believe they can be." William nodded thoughtfully. She's a remarkable woman. She is. You should tell her she helped change a hotel. Grace laughed softly. I don't think she'll believe me. Then tell her this instead. William looked around the ballroom one last time. Kindness doesn't always change the person who receives it. Sometimes, it transforms everyone who witnesses it. As evening settled over Charleston, warm golden light poured through the Grand Lexington's tall windows. Guests checked in. Employees welcomed them. The hotel continued doing what hotels had always done, offering people a place to rest. But something far more valuable now lived inside those historic walls. Not luxury, not prestige, not investment. Respect. Grace walked through the lobby carrying no cleaning cart for the first time in years. Yet she still paused to hold the door for an elderly guest. Still stopped to thank the valet working in the evening heat. Still smiled at every employee she passed by name. William watched quietly before leaving. He realized something that no balance sheet could ever measure. The greatest return on his investment had never been financial. It had been human. And somewhere in a modest apartment across Charleston, Aunt Evelyn smiled as Grace shared the story over a simple homemade dinner. She listened patiently before saying the same words she had repeated throughout Grace's life. I told you kindness never goes to waste. Grace smiled. No. It just takes time to find its way home. The lights of the Grand Lexington shimmered against the Charleston skyline as another evening began. Inside, every guest saw elegance. Every employee felt dignity. And everyone who crossed those doors became part of a quiet truth that would outlive every renovation, every contract, and every investment. A person's greatest value is never hidden beneath a uniform. It's revealed by the way they choose to treat another human being when they expect nothing in return. If this story touched your heart, leave a comment and share the kindness forward. When Grace Johnson knelt beside that older housekeeper to gather the towels scattered across the lobby floor, William Carter smiled, not because she had become a director, but because success had never changed the person she chose to be. In the end, the most important thing she carried wasn't a new title. It was the same quiet heart she had carried to that rainy bus stop. This story reminds us that a single moment of courage can redirect an entire life. Grace didn't know who she was helping that night. She simply chose to do the right thing when walking away would have been easier. Today, think of one person you usually pass without really seeing. Take a moment to say hello, offer a hand, or simply ask, "Are you doing okay?" The next time life feels unfair, remember what Grace chose to do instead of becoming bitter. Have you ever helped someone without knowing how that story ended? I'd truly love to hear about it in the comments below. And if Grace's journey stayed with you, leave a 1 in the comments so I know this story found its way to your heart. Until next time, take care of yourself. And don't miss the next story. Because sometimes the smallest decision changes far more lives than anyone could ever imagine.